day wasn't filled with media events, but there were still some interesting things happening. Today is June 25th, and at the end of this day, I'll give a brief overview of the main media events in the American press. There are mainly two topics: the issue of the US military bombing Iran's nuclear program and the NATO summit taking place in Europe, which President Trump is attending. So let's start with the results of the US military's bombing of Iran's nuclear program. Numerous articles in the mainstream media are dedicated to this topic, and the most important of them is an article by Natasha Bertrand on CNN, who, together with other co-authors, described the events that unfolded around the bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and other sites. The article is quite critical. Let's read it.
The U.S. military strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend did not destroy the core components of the country's nuclear program, and likely only set it back by months, according to an early U.S. intelligence assessment that was described by 7 people briefed on it. The assessment, which has not been previously reported, was produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's intelligence arm. It is based on a battle damage assessment conducted by U.S. Central Command in the aftermath of the U.S. strikes, one of the sources said. The analysis of the damage to the sites and the impact of the strikes on Iran's nuclear ambitions is ongoing and could change as more intelligence becomes available. But the early findings are at odds with President Donald Trump's repeated claims that the strikes completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth also said on Sunday that Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
The article criticizes the approach, and it also criticizes the results of the strikes that were carried out against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, claiming that the operation's objectives were not fully achieved. Well, honestly, that's a very strange claim, because the argument is basically about terminology. Was the nuclear program completely destroyed, or was it disabled to the point where it can no longer produce nuclear materials, which in general is basically the same thing? Here, of course, mainstream media are criticizing President Trump, who insists that Iran's nuclear program has been completely destroyed. Let's take a look at his post. In his posts, President Trump angrily speaks out against Natasha Bertrand, demands that she be fired, says that Iran's nuclear program has been completely destroyed, and claims that this is a tremendous success and victory for the United States, and that everything is great. He also mentions Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and talks about the tremendous, gigantic work that was done. And he's right. In fact, he is right, because as a result of these strikes, Iran's nuclear program has truly been destroyed or damaged to such an extent that it can no longer produce the nuclear materials necessary for the Iranian nuclear project. So, by and large, Iran's nuclear project has been destroyed, and it could take decades to restore it. Although journalists and experts say it might only take a few months. But that's hard to believe. It just can't be that way. We've all seen the aftermath of the bombing. We've all seen those explosions. We've seen the consequences of those blasts. Of course, nothing there could have remained untouched. In addition, journalists are raising the issue that the enriched uranium Iran had is now unaccounted for. Its location can't be determined. How much of it there is and what will happen to it next is also unknown. And there is, of course, some truth to that. However, I don't think the intelligence agencies are telling us the whole story regarding Iran's nuclear program. Again, I want to point out that there are rumors, unconfirmed ones, from sources within the Israeli government that the enriched uranium was removed from Iran's territory as part of an agreement between the United States and the Iranian leadership. And it was removed even before the strikes were carried out. That's the first part of the question. The second part is, why is enriched uranium needed at all? Enriched uranium is not used to produce nuclear weapons. The only bomb ever made from uranium-235 was the one dropped on Hiroshima. It existed as a single copy. They didn't even test it before using it in 1945. So that raises a lot of questions. All right, everyone is looking for where Iran's uranium went. where the uranium that was at Iran's disposal is, but what they should be looking for is plutonium, because nuclear weapons are made from plutonium. So there are a lot of questions, and we will continue to monitor the situation as it develops, because it's still far from over. At the same time, it's worth noting that, without a doubt, the U.S. military's attack on Iran's nuclear program and the subsequent end of the war between Israel and Iran is an undeniable success for the United States of America, and it's a major victory. Here's what else is being said about this.
Israel just stated that the nuclear sites were obliterated. Thank you to our great B-2 pilots and all others involved. We just caught the failing New York Times working with fake news CNN cheating again. They tried to demean the great work our B-2 pilots did, and they were wrong in doing so. These reporters are just bad and sick people. You would think they would be proud of the great success we had, instead of trying to always make our country look bad. Total obliteration. Last weekend, the United States successfully carried out a massive precision strike on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, and it was very, very successful. It was called obliteration. This incredible exercise of American strength has paved the way for peace with a historic ceasefire agreement. Natasha Bertrand should be fired from CNN. I watched her for 3 days doing fake news. She should be immediately reprimanded and then thrown out like a dog. She lied on the laptop from hell story, and now she lied on the nuclear site story, attempting to destroy our Patriot pilots by making them look bad when, in fact, they did a great job and hit pay dirt. Total obliteration. She should not be allowed to work at fake news CNN. It's people like her who destroyed the reputation of a once great network. Her slant was so obviously negative. Besides, she doesn't have what it takes to be an on-camera correspondent, not even close. Fire Natasha.
In addition, the Washington Post published an article about the upcoming briefing. Here's that article.
The White House plans to limit classified intelligence sharing with Congress after leaks to the press of an early assessment undermined President Donald Trump's claim that U.S. airstrikes obliterated Iranian nuclear facilities. A senior Trump administration official said, setting the stage for a contentious classified briefing before senators Thursday. Amid a political battle over what the intelligence shows, the White House is expected to send 4 of its top national security officials to brief lawmakers: Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, administration officials said. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who testified in March that U.S. intelligence agencies assessed that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, will be notably absent. Ratcliffe will represent the intelligence community, the senior Trump administration official said of Gabbard's absence, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss plans not yet made public. The media is turning this into something it's not. Trump has called Gabbard's assessment of Iran's nuclear program wrong and largely sidelined her in navigating the United States' role in the war between Iran and Israel. Current and former U.S. officials and people close to the White House told the Washington Post. White House officials have insisted that she is doing critical work. Senate Minority Leader Charles E. Schumer, Democrat, New York, on Wednesday called on the White House to immediately undo its decision to limit classified information sharing. The administration has no right to stonewall Congress on matters of national security, Schumer said on the Senate floor. Senators deserve information, and the administration has a legal obligation to inform Congress precisely about what is happening right now abroad.
Washington Post journalists point out that the head of the United States intelligence community will not be present at the closed briefing for senators and will not report on the results of the U.S. Air Force strikes on Iran's nuclear program. The journalists link this to the fact that the information held by the intelligence community does not match what President Donald Trump is saying, and that there are some secret matters they would prefer not to disclose. There's probably some logic to that. This is something worth discussing. And the fact that Tulsi Gabbard will not be present at the closed briefing for senators is, of course, a signal that there is something to hide. The only question is, are they hiding something good or something bad? So once again, we'll be waiting to see how this situation develops and what the outcome will be. Our next topic today is the NATO summit taking place in Europe. Global media have also published a lot of material on this topic. The summit is taking place amid controversy. As always, President Donald Trump is making statements that startle European leaders. Let's take a look at what's being written.
It must have been the last thing NATO's chief needed. Late Tuesday, on the eve of a crucial summit that would lock in a generational investment in NATO's defense, Donald Trump's Truth Social account pinged with a single photo. A gushing message signed, Mark Rutte, written in a carbon copy Trump style and overflowing with sycophantic praise for the U.S. president. "You are flying into another big success in The Hague this evening," Rutte's message read. "Europe is going to pay in a big way, as they should, and it will be your win," he continued. "You will achieve something no American president in decades could get done." While the diplomatic world has bent toward many norms of the Trump White House, this was extreme. Doubling down on the comments the following day, saying Trump deserved credit for his actions on Iran and NATO, Rutte waded through many observers' incredulity at his kowtowing tone.
As the article shows, President Trump managed to put pressure on the leaders of the European NATO countries to raise military spending to 5% of GDP by 2030. This is a positive move, and it's justified by Russia's aggressive behavior. It's true, there is currently a war with Ukraine, and in this case, Russia is the aggressor. So, countries that border Russia, like the Baltic states and Poland, are extremely alarmed by Russia's actions, and increasing NATO's defense spending is a natural response. However, in order to get European countries to agree to raise their defense spending, President Trump had to exert enormous pressure, including scaring European leaders so they would fully realize the danger of the current situation. And again, it can be said that President Trump achieved complete success here. So the summit was not in vain. European leaders agreed, and most importantly, NATO leader Mark Rutte is now openly talking about the Russian threat, saying that Europe must prepare for war and that military spending needs to be increased, which is entirely in line with what President Trump has been saying. In other words, they found common ground, and that's great. It's also worth noting that during the NATO summit in Europe, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was invited. Let's take a look at an article to see what is being written about this.
The Hague, Netherlands, AP. President Donald Trump met with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the NATO summit Wednesday and suggested that increased spending by the transatlantic alliance could help prevent future Russian aggression against its neighbors. NATO members agreed to raise their spending targets by 2035 to 5% of gross domestic product annually on core defense requirements, as well as defense and security-related spending. That target had been 2% of GDP.
During the NATO summit, President Zelensky was able to speak with President Trump and discuss pressing issues regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. As President Trump said, there was no talk of military aid. He simply wanted to hear about Ukraine's current situation. After the meeting, President Zelensky came out feeling much more positive and said that he was asking the United States for military assistance, as well as additional Patriot air defense systems. It seems that President Trump looked favorably upon this request. International news agencies also noted that this time President Zelensky showed up to the meeting with President Trump wearing a suit, which he had previously avoided many times and which had caused a scandal during his visit to the White House. So, apparently, we can also see both sides moving toward each other and building mutual understanding. Overall, the NATO summit is quite encouraging. European countries are starting to wake up. Ukraine needs additional assistance, and most likely it will get it. It has secured support, as always. But now this issue needs extra attention because the war in the Middle East has dulled the world's focus on the conflict in Ukraine. And there is a war going on in Ukraine, a very brutal one, and it's been going on for almost 4 years now, and it needs to be brought to an end. President Trump promised in his campaign pledges. He promised to end this war within 24 hours. But it's clear that this was impossible, and he called it sarcasm. Again, this was while he was at the NATO summit. However, President Trump is making enough efforts, strong enough efforts, to try to bring this conflict to an end in some way. And apparently, he is increasingly coming to the conclusion that the only way to end this conflict is to strengthen Ukraine as much as possible. That's why I expect that President Trump will eventually supply weapons and give Ukraine the ability to be on equal footing with Russia and repel its attacks in a way that will force President Putin to stop. That was the day. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like. And we really appreciate that you're watching, and your support is very important for our channel as we continue to grow. Thank you.